Hello, good morning.
Hi.
Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor Richard Nisbett. Hello, Professor Nisbett. How are you doing?
Okie doke. How are you?
I'm great, and my audience, those guys are excited because you are a big name. And today we're going to talk about culture and the geography of thought. We will also discuss your research on other cultures and why East Asians are not doing as well as we think they should be doing in some cases. But before we delve into these interesting issues, we're going to talk about an article you wrote some years ago titled Culture and Point of View. It was published in 2003. Now, Professor Nisbett, you are known for researching differences in thought between Asians and Westerners, including Americans and Europeans. And in this article, you contend that Easterners have a view of thought that is holistic, whereas Westerners are analytical. Why is this so?
Well, I think that the differences between cultures in this respect have everything to do with the economy, what people do in their working lives. And the differences between East and West go back thousands of years. The Chinese ecology is extremely favorable to large-scale agriculture. It's plains with rivers running all through it, good for irrigation. And Greece, on the other hand, is mountains descending to the sea, where mass agriculture is just not feasible in general. So people have kitchen gardens, they keep animals, they do trade, they do fishing, and the differences in economies are very marked because people in mass agriculture situations, especially rice agriculture situations, have to coordinate with one another in order to be effective in their daily lives. This creates an orientation toward other people and therefore toward the world at large, rather than the interior kind of posture that's possible for people who don't have an occupation that requires that kind of coordination.
All right. And then in your article, you refer to differences between the ancient Greeks and the Chinese. You said that the Chinese were they were more family oriented, whereas the Greeks were traders, and as a result, they had to contend with different types of people. Would you like to expound a little on this, please?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get your question.
No, in your article, you made some references to the differences in the Greeks and the Chinese lived. You said that the Chinese environment was more family oriented, was structured around the extended family.
Well, the environment made large scale agriculture possible, which is what determined the character of the people. And the same thing is true in Greece, but it was just a very different ecology, required different kinds of economies, which didn't require coordination with other people.
All right, let me read the statement for our audience. The Chinese were engaged in multiple complex role relations with other individuals, with the extended family, the village, and the representatives of state. The socially interdependent Chinese would always have been looking outward, trying to coordinate their actions with those of others while minimizing social friction. The Greeks, on the other hand, were relatively independent, having fewer and less complex social relations than did the Chinese.
Right.
Yeah, that's the point I was referring to earlier. And another interesting takeaway from the article is that you also examined how the Greeks viewed logic versus the Chinese, whereas despite being brilliant and producing technologies, the Greeks were able to create what we refer to as formalized logic. Why didn't this occur in China?
Well, partly because Greeks could be so independent. There was quite a bit of discussion and argument in the marketplace. And the story goes, I don't know if it's true, but I love it, that Aristotle invented formal logic because he wanted to say, look, can we agree that if your argument has this structure, this underlying structure, it's a lousy argument? And that gave rise to formal logic. Whatever the reason, Greece and subsequently the West have always been enamored of formal logic. China was never that interested in logic. It was never formalized. There was only an interest in it in around the 5th century BC. And after that, the interest sort of petered out. Today, even Japanese for sure, and I imagine the same is true to a degree for the rest of East Asia. If someone argues too logically, emphasizes the structure of argument, it's considered immature.
Whereas in the West, if you're not logical, you're considered silly and infantile.
Right.
Yeah, because well, I'm not an American, but Jamaica is a part of the West politically, at least, because we were once a colony of Britain, and we're taught to argue in a logical and coherent manner.
Right.
So I can't imagine living in a culture where if I'm too logical or too argumentative, I'm seen as infantile.
Yes, right.
But Professor, in your article, you also refer to terms to important terms such as low context versus high context. What do we mean by a low context society versus a high context society?
Well, in a high context society, what you do is very much dependent on the situation. It's governed by that. Low context societies, you're much more free to do anything you want, independent of the context. So social life is much more governed by pretty clear rules in the East, as opposed to the West, which tends to be much looser and less structured.
And what about power distance? That's a popular term in cultural anthropology.
I'm sorry, say that again.
What do we mean by power distance?
I still haven't gotten the phrase. I'm sorry.
Power distance.
I'm still not getting it. Could you spell it?
Okay, POWERDISTANCE, power distance.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's not a phrase I use very often. It's how much distance is allowed between superiors and inferiors. In the East, societies are more hierarchically organized. To give you an example, I had a Korean student, very brilliant student named Inchol Che, who, after he had been working with me for a while, said, I should tell you that early on when we started working together, I was trying to figure out how old you were. Because if you were older than 50, it would be out of the question for me to disagree with you. And I can tell you, the littlest undergraduate who's an American won't hesitate to disagree with me. So it's a huge difference there. The difference is so great that he can't even disagree.
Yeah, so for example, Richard, I'm in my 20s and you're an older man and I'm calling you Richard, but in my culture, someone like yourself is Dr. or Professor Richard.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
And if this were 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and maybe even today in Germany, it would be Herr Professor Dr. Nisbett. So, but it's been a long time since anyone's called me Dr. Nisbett or Professor Nisbett, anyone in the educational setting. I mean,
And Richard, in my correspondence with Westerners, I recognize that they are direct speakers. So, for example, if you're sending an email to someone in a Western country and you write, Friday at 10 is a good time, the person will respond by saying, this Friday you must state at Friday at 10 we're going to meet. Yes, I've been picking that up. Their language is extremely direct.
right, direct. I mean, Westerners are are direct in general. And of course, on most of these dimensions, uh, Americans who are Westerners are more Western than anybody else.
Y-
We're more individualist, we're more abrupt, we're more frank, etc. So,
and Americans also teach their children to be individualistic when compared to other countries in Europe.
right. You're supposed to be individualistic. You're supposed to have a distinctive personality. And you're supposed to have all the edges rubbed off in Eastern society for the most part. I mean, there are exceptions to this. And I must say, I feel that China is moving in a much more individualist direction um, in late years. So there are changes that are going on even today.
I obviously you're familiar with the frontier thesis, but some years ago, an article was published by the National Bureau of Economic Research corroborating it. That is actually true. Like that those countries are in reality more individualistic.
Which countries?
The frontier thesis in America, states
Yes,
in
right.
America closer to the frontier are more individualistic. This is actually true. It was tested some years ago.
Right. Yes. That was, I think, by a student of mine named Dove Cohen was one of the people involved in that. Yeah, it's certainly true. Let me make a little side comment first about Japan. Uh, in Japan is highly collectivistic, highly interdependent, but not the island of Hokkaido,
Mhm.
which they think of as the Wild West. It's the frontier. People are much more individualistic there. So there can be big differences within countries. There's a wonderful book that's come out recently that I recommend to everybody called American Nations. And it's ethnography of 11 different national cultures within the US. The first two, of course, were the Puritan culture in Massachusetts and the upper class Western England of Virginia. Very different cultures. And it turns out that these cultural characteristics are quite useful in predicting who's going to get vaccinated against COVID. Um, and in general, the Puritans and their culture, their surviving culture in New England, are very likely to be vaccinated. And in many of the other national culture groups, such as the Deep South, the Appalachian, uh, Scotch Irish population, the far west, they're much less likely to get vaccinations. In China, by the way, there's been virtually no problem with COVID because everybody behaved correctly. It's easier to get uh, East Asians to behave properly than it is to get Americans to behave properly. It's like herding cats.
But I'm not surprised that some Americans are uninterested in the vaccine because American culture is individualistic and there's a relationship between individualism and the ability to comply with certain rules.
Yes, exactly.
And then again, I I'm not an anti-vaxxer. The concept of opposing vaccine is actually very specific to America, but in light of the COVID vaccine, it is still an experimental product. Some persons have died after consuming it, others contracted COVID again. So I do believe that if you're going to take the vaccine, you should have insight into your own genetic processes. That's just the sensible option.
It's, yeah, well, your point is well taken, but it's a cost benefit analysis thing. I mean, there are very few vaccinations that cause severe problem, and that includes the ones for COVID. I mean, there are like a handful of people who have had unfortunate consequences, whereas there are 600,000 Americans who've died of COVID so far.
Yeah.
So the
But
odds are definitely in favor at this point of taking the vaccine.
but I've always wondered how would medieval people respond to COVID? Because during that era, people were more likely to die in youth. And COVID is a dangerous disease, but there are other diseases more dangerous than COVID. And we are responding quite hysterical because for several years, we were not encountering a pandemic. We're accustomed to living to 70 and not dying because of the cold or the common flu. Whereas historically, people die because of ailments, a simple cut, etc. So I've always wondered how would medieval people respond to a disease like COVID compared to the plague?
Right. By the way, vaccinations have been around since there was the plague. Uh, Indians invented it, and the English invented it. And probably it was invented by any number of other cultures independently as well. And that's for smallpox. And the observation was that people, the milkmaids who were with cows all the time, didn't get smallpox. There's something called cowpox. So the guess was, maybe they were being surrounded by animals with this problem, and maybe they developed an immunity. So they said, well, let's try giving someone, inserting some smallpox material into people, a small amount, and see if it prevents smallpox. And sure enough, it did. And by the way, that's a case where vaccination has completely eliminated a disease. Smallpox no longer exists except in one vial in one laboratory in the US. And there's a controversy over whether to keep it or not, or to destroy that.
Well, based on the new data that we have been exploring, if a lab is operating below par, then serious things may occur. So I do believe that that specimen should be destroyed.
Yeah, you may well be right. I haven't thought about it enough to have an opinion about it.
Yes, no, yes. Look, I'm not prone to conspiracy theories, but politicians can never be trusted at 100%.
Well, that's a strong argument for destroying it, that's for sure.
Exactly. At any point, remember, no one expected America to elect Donald Trump, and he won, and would have been even more successful if he didn't tweet as much as he did.
Right. Well, actually, early on, Trump kept asking people in the government, hey, we have these nuclear weapons, why can't we use them? If he knew about that smallpox thing, he would say, hey, we have this smallpox thing sitting in a lab. Why can't we use it?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to speak for a long time on Donald Trump, but what's interesting about Trump is that he has the ability to make a difference because he's a decisive man. It's just that he's unread and uninformed.
Right.
So, for example, even the Paris Treaty, he could have fashioned more elaborate arguments to state why America should not be a part of it.
Right. Well, Donald Trump turns out to be a smarter person than many people believed, and a much more ignorant person than many people had any guess about. Here's a man who thought that Finland was part of Russia. I mean, so the ignorance is staggering. Actually, I don't know anybody. I know a wide range of people. I don't know anyone who's as ignorant as Donald Trump is on some very important matters.
Well, maybe Donald Trump reads a history on the Russian Empire, so that's how he was able to make the link between Russia and Finland.
Right. Right.
Maybe.
Undoubtedly, there was a time when Finland was part of Russia.
You know, Russia once had political clout in Finland, but physically, Russia is not Finland.
Right.
So maybe, well, I doubt he reads the history of the Russian Empire. But back to our conversation. The paper on rugged individualism, it was actually produced in 2020 by someone called S. Bazi. So it's a very recent paper.
Who is that?
S. Bazi.
No, I don't know that person.
Yeah,
that finding is older than that, though, and Dove Cohen was involved in that. And
yeah.
I mean, they may be making rather different points, but the general fact about the individualism of the West
And frontier societies in America in early settlement.
Right. And that's why I brought up Japan, is because they have their own frontier society. And guess what? It's very individualistic. So,
But Professor, back to your point about China and individualism, a study was actually done, again, another recent study saying that city air actually makes us free. In the sense that when people migrate to city and they become more urbanized, they develop new philosophies and are more likely to accept differences. So if China becomes more urbanized, maybe it could result in higher levels of individualism.
yeah, maybe. Well, there's plenty of urban living there now, and I'm not sure that the society has moved in that direction. It would be interesting to know. It would
Yeah,
be,
remember China is still a young society in the stage of capitalist economics. So maybe we should give them a next 50 or even 100 years.
of course, there are not significant ethnic differences in China. 95% of Chinese are Han ethnicity. There are 50 other ethnicities in China, but they're very invisible. There's so few of them, except for the Uyghurs. We're paying quite a bit of attention to the Uyghurs these days.
Yes. And then there's also the issue of rice versus wheat. Wheat cultures in China are more individualistic, whereas the
Right,
rice cultures are more collectivistic.
right, exactly.
And there's a link between individualism and income, whereas the individualistic regions tend to be richer on average.
Right.
Have you ever studied the link between individualism and income?
No, I haven't actually. Um, I haven't. I'm not going to speculate because I haven't really thought about
Yeah,
it.
it's not good to speculate, but based on what I've been seeing, there is a link, and I think that individualistic people are richer because of their ability to deviate from the norm. So you get up one day and say, I'm going to start Microsoft Word, and people laugh, and Microsoft Word becomes a multi-billion dollar company.
Right,
So I think the link between individualism is through the channel of deviating from norms.
right. Of course, there are some highly collectivist cultures that are quite rich. I mean, Japan, um, Korea, etc. So I don't think individualism is required for being rich, but within a given society, do the more individualistic people make more money? I don't know. Interesting question.
Well, I do know that they're more likely to invest in the stock market.
I'm sorry.
I do know that they're more likely to invest in the stock market.
Oh,
And back to your point about individualism and collectivism, a study was done by Mark Zachary Taylor, and he gave the edge to individualistic societies, but he also argued that collectivistic societies can promote innovation at the national level. So it cannot be familial collectivism, it must be national collectivism, because national collectivism promotes trust.
right, right.
Yes, so many interesting studies, but I have a question for you. No, a true question. Why are Westerners more likely to promote their distinctiveness?
More likely to
To
promote.
promote their distinctiveness. That's mentioned in your paper, Culture and Point of View.
Well, you mean individuality, uh, to be individually distinct from one another,
Yes, that's what I mean.
right? Uh, well, if you're freed from the social constraints that are characteristic of collectivist societies, you have the ability to be more individualistic. And let's face it, it's more in cultures which have lots of highly distinctive individuals. Whatever else about them, they're more interesting than those where people are trying to be very much the same and not to stand out. There's a notion in East Asia that individuals who are too different from other people are to be avoided. There's an expression saying the empty wagon makes the most noise. So people who stand out from a crowd it's not attractive. They'll be socially punished to a degree.
Yes, and let me read this snippet from your study. In one clever study, Koreans and Americans were given a choice among different colored pens to have as a gift. Americans chose the rarest color, whereas Koreans chose the most common color.
Right. Yeah. A lovely study.
Yeah, and these findings have been replicated on a number of occasions. Western academics are more confident, they overrate their abilities, and they value radical creativity.
Right, exactly. I have a lovely anecdote about that difference. A friend of mine who's a Canadian, a European Canadian, spent uh, many years in Japan. And when it came time for him to, he was getting his degree at an American university. When it came time to apply for a job, the letter said, I would like to put my name in, although I don't feel, that by any means that I am terribly distinguished, but still I may have something to offer. And his Canadian advisor said, "What the hell are you writing?" What he was writing was a very good Japanese letter of inquiry about a job. So you really, I mean, Asians move in a Western individualistic direction when they live in the West, and the opposite is true of Westerners, or the same is true of Westerners who move in an Eastern direction if they live there.
Yes, but a little side point. Professor Nisbett, are you interested in the heritability of traits?
Well, modestly, any psychologist is going to be somewhat interested in it.
I pose the question because I'm seeing a resurgence of interest in the topic, especially in the area of individualism versus collectivism, where some are arguing that people from individualistic cultures, when they migrate to a foreign culture, they're still more individualistic. If the country of ancestry values creativity, they're creative in a foreign country. And if the culture is collectivistic, when they're in an individualistic country, they're still collectivistic.
Right. I don't doubt that there is. I mean, look, every dimension on which people differ, uh, like that, characteristics, distinctive characteristics, does have a genetic component. It tends to be, the genes tend to account for roughly 50% of the variation in a population on dimensions such as extroversion, agreeableness, uh, um, uh, conscientiousness, and so on. And it's about probably on average about a 50% accounting for differences in a population for intelligence, roughly 50%.
Yes, and the late Alessina, he had some quite spectacular papers on the topic. So, for example, countries that used the plow in the past, today they have higher levels of gender inequality.
Wait, say that again?
I said the late Professor Alessina, who died about a year ago, he has some interesting papers on the topic. So, for example, he observed a link between the use of the plow and gender inequality.
A link between what and
The,
gender?
the use of the plow.
The use of the claw.
No, not claw, plow, PLOW. We're talking about farming.
Oh, yes, the use of the plow. So
Yes,
to say the sentence again, I got the word now, plow.
yes, and gender inequality.
Huh, really? So societies
Yes,
use the plow are more gender unequal.
yes, because agricultural productivity favored men because men were physically dominant.
Interesting. I
Yeah,
mean, it's interesting because one of the most individualistic societies and one of the most egalitarian, gender egalitarian societies in the history of the world was uh, the Scandinavians. Those pictures of Scandinavian women with their war helmets on and so on. That was for real. Women could participate in war making. in Scandinavia, and they didn't live so much by the plow as they did the by fishing.
Exactly, brilliant confirmation. And another example is the Dayumi society. Women could serve in the military and they were often quite dangerous.
What society?
Dayumi in Africa, the warrior women of Dayumi in Africa.
Interesting. I didn't. That's a Dahomey.
Yeah, Dahomey, yes.
No, I did not know that.
Yeah,
Interesting.
the Amazon woman. That's another fascinating area of study. But I read your piece on culture and point of view already, and I am looking at a sentence that's quite striking. And you're right. Koreans are better able to judge an employer's true feelings about an employee from ratings of the employee than are Americans. Is this because collectivism forces them to read people's emotions?
I think so. I don't remember writing that sentence.
You're
Sounds
citing someone. Remember, this paper is quite old. It's like
right.
what, 18?
Right. Yeah, it's you really have to pay much more attention. I mean, it's all part of coordination with other people. In order to be effective, you have to. My first hint of all this, by the way, was like decades ago. I was visited by a Japanese psychologist, and we had a very interesting conversation. And at the end of the conversation, he says, I want to tell you about a difference between you, an American, and me, a Japanese. Before I came to you, talk to you, I thought about what we might discuss, what you might be like, what I would do if you did such and such a thing. And after I leave here, I will be ruminating about the conversation. Did it go well? Did I say what I wanted to say? Did I understand what you were going to say? And my guess is I didn't exist for you before I stepped into your office, and I will cease to exist the moment I step out. Yep, he's got my number.
Okay, quite interesting point. Westerners care less about how people view them, and I think that this is a plus. So, for example, if I like to write, I've written a few columns, and if I get a criticism that's constructive, I may add on it. But if it is stupid or just downright dubious, why should I invest in that criticism? That doesn't make sense.
Right. By the way, if I may ask, you may or may not want to include this in the interview, but I just interested in Jamaica. Where does the Jamaica lie on this dimension of individualism?
Okay, so the Hofstede's measurement does not have sufficient data for Jamaica, but based on my research, Jamaica is more embedded than autonomous and closer to collectivism than individualistic. And interestingly, people in Jamaica often assume that Jamaica is an individualistic society, but we're closer to the collectivistic spectrum.
Interesting.
Jamaicans like conformity. Usually, Jamaica is promoted by the local media and international media as a place where indiscipline is rampant. But if you were to do a study surveying the opinions of Jamaicans, especially on blogs, they like conformity. Let me give you a perfect example. There is a law in Jamaica, and this law makes it a crime to swear in public. Jamaicans swear all the time in public, but one politician wanted to repeal an aspect of the law to allow dancehall entertainers to swear during a concert without getting arrested. And Jamaicans were quite upset, even though they swear in public all the time. They tend to conform to broader meta narrative, even if they don't comply with such rules.
Right.
That's quite compelling.
Well, interestingly, I mean, American blacks live in cultures, subcultures, which are quite collectivist in some ways, but of course quite individualistic in other ways. I mean, it's I've been read that Black mothers will try to get their kids to be entertaining and interesting and will egg them on to do that, uh, which is you would think would be characteristic of a much more individualistic culture. uh, than Black culture in general. But I've yet to see a really good empirical analysis of American Black subcultures with respect to individualism.
Well, there are some studies. I've read a few studies. They're more sociological than quantitative, but they do suggest that American blacks are less individualistic than whites.
Yeah,
And because of individualism, white Americans are more likely to save and invest. Black Americans have less tolerance for risk, so they're unlikely to invest in the stock market. Even affluent Americans are still unlikely to hold risky assets.
interesting. I didn't know that.
Yes, so a part of the wealth gap is related to risk tolerance and individualism. And a study was done by foreign researchers. I believe it covered another country, maybe Singapore, and it concluded that individualistic people invest in the stock market because they're more confident.
Right,
So individualism is linked to optimism.
right. That's highly plausible to me.
Yes. Well, you're a psychologist, a well-read psychologist. You're not an economist, but some years ago, Enrico Spolahore, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, he did a paper, The Diffusion of Technology, and he argues that there is a link between genetic distance and the ability of countries to adopt foreign technology. The research is actually growing. The argument is that we're more likely to adopt the practices of people who share our commonalities. So if a technology emerges in Korea, people from Japan and China may adopt it before Americans.
Right.
And some actually attribute the income gap across countries to what they call genetic distance. There's not a gene coding for individual. There's not a gene coding for economic growth and wealth creation per se, but because of genetic and cultural similarities, we're more likely to appropriate the culture of similar peoples.
Right. Well, that's interesting. But of course, um, Americans are sort of notorious for uh, adopting some aspect of culture and running with it, and they carrying it to an extreme. I mean, uh, nobody in the West exercises like Americans do. I mean, we all are. It's religious observance to go to the gym or to run in the street and so on. I mean, no, even other Western societies are not like that. But fads take hold quickly here and disappear quickly.
Well, Americans are individualistic, so I guess they're obsessed with self-image. And one way to become more unique is to augment your body structure.
Right.
So I'm not surprised that Americans like the gym, but gym culture in America is being exported elsewhere. Just like cancel culture. One writer, Robert Anderson, argues that Americans are exporting cancel culture. So Americans import foreign cultures, refine them or mutate them, and then re-export them elsewhere.
Yeah, it's a great image. I think that sounds
Yes,
right.
but I don't. Are you still in the business of doing research? Because I'm looking at papers that you wrote in 2018. So I'm guessing that you're energetic.
Well, you're guessing that I'm what?
Energetic.
Energetic. Yeah, yes, to a fault. um, but yeah, I continue to do some research, and I don't tend to do the legwork anymore. I'm not all that energetic, but I certainly do enjoy research still.
Yeah. Well, I guess you work with younger scholars. Maybe you should encourage them to study Trinidad or Jamaica or some country in the Caribbean. As a researcher, I need more data on the Caribbean, and it's a interesting place. So, for example, trust is quite low in Jamaica and Trinidad. High trust societies are wealthier. Why is trust so low in the Caribbean? This is a really important topic to be studied.
Well, I've read that there's low trust in general in Western African nations. So it may just be a carryover of that culture. Um, I have no idea why that should be true, if it is of West Africa, but that's what I've read.
The long run determinants of culture. Africa is diverse, and some have argued that there's a link between diversity and lower levels of trust.
Really? Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's work by
Alessina
Harvard.
again.
What's that?
Alessina, the economist who died.
Oh, and well, there's a sociologist who's showed that um, in diverse cultures, there's less trust. I mean, if everybody in your neighborhood is like you, a Scandinavian American or an Italian American or a Black, there's more trust of people within that culture. But if it's highly diverse, I don't know if I can trust that guy. I don't know where he's coming from. So it's scarcely surprising that diversity leads to a lowering of trust, but it's unfortunate.
Yes, you're right. So, although there is a link between diversity and lower levels of trust, researchers also argue that if the political establishment can encourage cooperation across racial and ethnic lines, economic growth is the result. So, diversity is only a problem when people don't like each other. But if we get them to cooperate, it becomes a blessing.
Right. I've a friend of mine is a Black psychologist from Chicago. It's Claude Steele. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah, I know him. I've heard of him.
and when he was growing up in Chicago, he's now in his 70s. There were three major ethnic groups that did the work, the blue collar work of Chicago: Poles, uh, Irish, I guess, and Blacks. And he said that you had to make the work gang be ethnically consistent. I mean, I had to have a gang of Blacks or a gang of Poles. You can't throw them together because they won't understand each other. They won't like each other. You'll get fights and so on. I don't know whether that's true among working class people today or not. I'm sure it's less true than it was.
Well, I'm not surprised by his findings because Calvin Wilson, long deceased, he wrote a book on slavery in America. He was tracking the ownership of slaves by blacks, and he contends that blacks from Africa came from different groups and they often fought each other. For
Right.
example, even when they were on the ship coming to the New World, conflicts emerged because of ethnic cultural differences.
Interesting. I did not know
Yeah,
that.
Calvin Wilson died a long time ago. Most people no longer remember him, but I developed an interest in slavery recently, so I stumbled upon Calvin and it's well, not his books, but he has some articles online that you can read for free.
Right.
Yeah, Calvin Wilson.
Yeah.
But you wrote a paper some time ago, maybe around 2018, and it looked at cognitive style. It's titled East-West Differences in Cognitive Style and Social Orientation. Are they real? And this paper is different from your previous research because you looked at Asians across social and economic backgrounds. Tell us a little about it.
Uh, I'm sorry. Give me the question again.
Oh, the name of the paper is East-West Differences in Cognitive Style and Social Orientation.
Right.
Are they real? And in the abstract, you said that this is the first paper to really concretize your arguments in relation to differences in cognitive style. And you looked at the differences in cognitive style across groups based on age and social class, etc., etc.
Right. Well, prior to that, I mean, social psychologists have been doing research on cultural differences, especially West versus East, for 25 years now. But nearly all the data, not surprisingly, comes from college students. And we do find marked differences, East versus West, in that population. But maybe the differences aren't so large. for people who are working class, or for adults or for older adults and so on. So in this paper, several of us got together to look at populations that are much more difficult to get hold of, working class people and older people and so on, professional people, to see if the cultural differences that are found at the national level are found throughout the societies. And it turns out that they are. They're quite, the differences that are marked for college students are marked for populations as a whole.
Exactly. Interesting study. But you also note in the article that over time, societies can change, and these differences, to an extent, are impacted by the economic structure. So
Right.
my question is this: I do understand the long run determinant of culture, but with increasing in look, Japan is a better example than China, because Japan was the first Western country to modernize and adopt the West and adopt Western policies. But why it is still collectivistic? Why are we not seeing that change?
That's actually an extremely interesting question to me, and I don't really know the difference. And I think we are seeing a shift towards more individualism, for example, in China. But Japan remains Japan. I mean, it has all of the characteristics, economic characteristics of a rich Western country, but it remains, uh, heavily collectivist, heavily interdependent, uh, heavily social rule governed society. And I don't know why there's been so little carryover from the economic change to broad social changes.
Yeah, Japan is really a potent example, because even during this period of isolation, the Japanese kept a close watch on the Dutch. So, based on what I've been reading, for foreign policy purposes, Japan wants to be a strong country. And if you're going to be a strong country, you need to have the best technology. So, the Japanese want to be rich, but they don't really want to be like Westerners.
Right, for some reason. Well,
Yeah.
we'll
You
see
may,
whether China looks more like Japan or more like the West in the next generation.
Well, the Harvard Business Review recently had a piece debunking the notion that China may become like the West. And for the most part, I agree with the writers. People tend to discredit the impact of legalism on China's political culture. China is a rule by law state, not a rule of law state, and will remain a rule by law state for a long time.
Yeah, well,
The Chinese government has managed to provide goodies. And if you keep people happy, they may not be inclined to change.
right. Sounds right.
Yeah, really fascinating stuff. But we're going to talk a little about honor cultures. You are also famous for your book, The Culture of Honor. What's a culture of honor?
Well, the aspect of the culture of honor that interests me most is the response to an insult. There are some societies where if one male insults another male, he's risking his life. And that's true, for example, in Arab culture today. It certainly was true of the Wild West in the U.S. And in the South in general. And so, I mean, we've demonstrated that if there is an insult, um, uh, Southerners feel like it would be appropriate to punch somebody. And if someone else made a pass at your girlfriend, I mean, even if you killed them, that wouldn't be so terrible. And speaking of cultural hangovers, that is, differences which maintain themselves over time, we did a study at the University of Michigan, where we got students who had grown up in the North or who had grown up in the South, and we put them in a situation where they get insulted. And the Northerners just sort of brush it off. I mean, what's your problem? The Southerners bristle. I mean, they're furious. And if you measure testosterone levels, the testosterone level of a Southerner goes up when he's insulted, but not Northerners. So the question is, why does this happen? And the generalization that I came upon, which turns out to be universal. Anthropologists don't like generalizations about cultures, but they will admit the following generalization. Herding peoples are tough guys. And the reason for that is if I keep sheep, my whole livelihood depends on sheep. And if you think you can get away with insulting me, what else can you get away with? So I'll make clear that if you insult me, you're in big trouble. I'm going to beat you up, or maybe even kill you. That's to maintain this stance of invulnerability that's important for the herdsman. Now, the U.S. North was founded by farmers from England and Germany and Holland, and the South was founded by these Western English people who were actually part of the culture of honor themselves. They were nobility, the most prominent people in the society, and by the Scotch Irish. And the Scotch Irish were herding peoples wherever they were. So different, and that cultural difference in response to the insults, there's no longer any reason for it. I mean, these University of Michigan students who are from the South, they're going to be doctors and lawyers. They're not going to be herdspeople. But the culture hangs around for a while, even when the purposes that it serves are no longer there.
Yes, and I would describe Jamaica as a honor culture. There are some cases, they're not quite rampant, but we do have examples of people who were attacked because they looked at someone and the person didn't like it. And actually, social research suggests that Jamaicans value status to a great degree. So
Right,
they're likely to wage war when it is felt that their status has been violated.
right,
So I would put Jamaica in the category of a culture of honor. And secondly, slavery plays a role. In Barbados, slavery was brutal, but because Bayesian slaves were constrained by geography, the incentive to revolt was lower. And secondly, Bayesian planters were managerial. They offered incentives to slaves, and those who complied were rewarded. And eventually, smarter people would have complied because the country is constrained by geography. Whereas Jamaican planters were brutal, offered less incentives, and in Jamaica, to get ahead, slaves often partnered with enslavers to sabotage their peers. So
to
maybe,
sabotage what?
yes,
To sabotage what?
their peers. So, for example, in slavery in Jamaica, there was a divide and conquer strategy. The slaves who reported revolts were rewarded. House slaves were treated better. Pen slaves were better off, and slave drivers were also respected. Now, in Barbados, the model was similar, but because of geography, slaves had an incentive to comply. So, over time in Barbados, people were more likely to follow rules than to revolt. So, for example, during the 19th century, compared to other countries in the region, the police force in Barbados was dominated by blacks because elites in Barbados reposed confidence in their ability to remain committed to their goals.
Right.
So even though the demographics and culture are a bit similar, there are nuances between slavery in Jamaica and Barbados.
Right,
but I must tell you, Professor, I'm just speculating based on research. I'm yet to see a study making these points.
right.
But
Well, interesting.
I think someone should take it up. Maybe you or one of our students.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, yeah,
the Caribbean is fascinating.
well, there's been very little systematic uh, social psychological research uh, on Caribbeans with respect to the kinds of questions that I've studied. Um, in fact, there's no, I mean, there, even a culture like India, I mean, we have huge amounts of data on China, Japan, Korea, on these uh, issues of collectivism and the kind of cognitive studies that I do, but almost nothing on India, almost nothing on South America, almost nothing on the Caribbean. I don't know why.
Yeah, I don't know, but we talk. I like to study Europe, but we have a lot of data on Europe.
Right.
We know about European farming practice. We know about nobility system. We know a whole lot about Europe, but not enough about other places in the Caribbean and Africa. So recently, I interviewed Jeffrey Williamson, and he said that if he were to become an economist again, he would study Africa
Mhm. And why is that?
because our information is increasing, and Africa. Pre-colonial institutions in Africa are very important for explaining long-term developmental practices. So we now have more data on pre-colonial institutions in Africa. So for example, the Asante Empire is quite interesting. And I mentioned Dahomey recently, and then the Igbo people. We now have more data on the Igbos of Nigeria. In the
Right.
past, we weren't furnished with data, but now we have the data to do proper research.
Right.
Yeah, but moving on to your third paper, why East Asians but not South Asians are underrepresented in leadership positions in the United States?
Well, it's
Question.
very, it's
What?
very interesting.
Yes.
It's related to the some of the things we've been talking about. Um, the uh, the East Asian, keeps his head down. He doesn't try to stand out. That would doesn't try to be terribly interesting and individualistic. Those are just countercultural for them, even for Asian Americans who, just like these Southerners retain their honor culture, the East Asians retain their collectivist kind of culture. For whatever reason, Indians are not like that. I must say, I've the Indians, this is anecdotal, and I've got some good data, which I'm going to talk about those good data first before I um, start talking anecdote. Uh, but there's a concept among Asian uh, business people of uh, the what is this the bamboo ceiling.
Ceiling.
Right. So, which means that Asians don't make it to the top of corporations. And you say, well, maybe it's prejudice. Oh, not so fast, because Indian and Pakistani and Ceylonese, Sri Lankans, uh, are more likely to move up to the top of a corporation than white Americans. I mean, so something's going on there. And so my colleagues started looking at the behavior of business school students. And the Indian students are very assertive. I mean, in a discussion class, they're going to have their say, and they're going to be quite likely to disagree with other people. They're assertive, in other words, and East Asians are not. Well, you're not going to get to the top of a corporation in America if you're not assertive. So this is what I think we should do. I believe you're wrong about that. I mean, kinds of behaviors that are uncomfortable for people of East Asian origin are not at all uncomfortable for Indians. And now to the anecdote, I've started meeting Indians lately. My daughter dated a 25-year-old. She was Indian, And I always felt when I was with him that somehow he was in control of the situation. I mean, and not in an aggressive way. It's just, he's assertive, has ideas about what should be done and what he wants to talk about and so on. So, okay, let him take the reins. So I have no idea why South Asians should be different in that way. But it's interesting that debate as an activity is very rare in East Asia. I don't believe they do debates like we do in college students here, but debate has always been a part of Indian life. They've always done that. And if you can debate, I mean, you have to be an assertive person. So this is what's the case, and these are the facts, and you should believe what I'm saying. I mean, that's a tradition in India, and it's not in East Asia.
Let me read this striking statistic. Even in the tech industry, where Asians are the ethnic group most likely to be hired, over 30% of the workforce, they are the least likely to be promoted to senior leadership positions, less than 15% of executives.
Right?
A real
No,
bamboo ceiling.
very striking.
Yeah, and you attribute it to personality. I agree with you to an extent. And I've read pieces making the link between the culture of debate in India and its colonial roots in some cases.
Right. Oh, but
Yes.
it goes further than that. I mean,
Yes.
it's thousands of years that they've been debating, and the formal logic. This is quite interesting. Formal logic was invented by the Indians independently of the West, and not at all in East Asia. And if you're debating, you're going to come upon formal logic. I'm going to say, look, I'm going to take your argument apart. That is, I'm going to use formal logic to assess what you're saying. That comes naturally to Indians and not to East Asians in general.
All right. So we're wrapping up now, but I cannot allow you to leave without asking this question. What is intelligence and how we can and how can we get it?
Well, as you might guess, I think about this all the time. Have a book on intelligence. Um, it's, I mean, the people who studied intelligence, they focused on the IQ test. I mean, well, your IQ, that's the golden number that tells you how smart you are. And I've come to feel intelligence certainly in the society we live in today has everything to do with knowledge and very little to do with raw brain power stuff. I mean, think about the people who are not getting vaccinated in this country. It's not that they're stupid, but a lot of them are not doing it because they're ignorant of science. They don't understand that if scientists are saying something, you know, the smart money believes them. Or a lot of people are in this country are suckers for conspiracy theories like QAnon. That's not because they have low brain power, it's because they're ignorant. I mean, they don't understand the way journalism works. And they don't understand, for example, that they're not going to read a lie in the New York Times because the New York Times is desperate to be accurate. They certainly want to make you more liberal.
Yeah, but the new I read the New York Times quite a bit some years ago, but these days I'm not fond of the New York Times.
No, me neither. I've fallen out. I used to say my religion's with the National Science Foundation, the New York Times.
Yeah, like the New York Times has a good piece called The Upshot, and I like gray matters, but in terms of opinion writing, you cannot trust those people. The best writer at the New York Times is Thomas Edsall. I like Thomas.
Oh, I know the name. I'm not sure. I don't have an identity
Yeah,
associated.
yeah. Like he's been around for a long time, but he's popular, but Thomas is not the type to promote himself. But the New York Times, like I can't take it seriously.
Yeah. Well,
Especially with the 1619 project and some other issues relating to politics and identity politics. Sorry.
no, it's completely shot its reputation with a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah. But again, so we're wrapping up. But before you go, uh, Richard, some time ago you wrote an article in Vox and you were criticizing Charles Murray.
Right.
What's your objection to Murray and his research?
Well, um, uh, I mean, first of all, in his book with Herrnstein, which was very famous, The Bell Curve, and gave most educated Americans their view of intelligence, which is utterly wrong. The idea that it's largely genetically determined, that early life experiences matter very little, that you can't, that poor minority children can't have their intelligence improved. I mean, everything in that book basically is wrong. And that, so my book, which is essentially a refutation of the understanding of intelligence in their book. But actually, there's a backstory here, which is the issue of black and white differences in intelligence was brought to the fore by a paper decades and decades ago in the Harvard Educational Review by Arthur Jensen,
Yes.
where he argued that black-white differences in IQ are partly genetically determined. I read that article when it first came out, and I said, "Oh, damn, there goes that ball game." But for some reason, I cycled back and read that paper again in the late 80s or early 90s, and the evidence is just feeble. I mean, the evidence in favor of a genetic contribution is pathetic. I mean, it's not there. So I started to look seriously at the question of, is there a genetic basis for that? And there actually is a wonderful natural experiment that we have that allows us to test that, which is that the American Black population is about 20% European genes. So that means that individual Blacks may be mostly European in their genetic origin, or they may be 100% African. So we can ask the question, is it an advantage for a Black person in the US to have European genes? And the answer is no. And we have many ways of looking. You can look at blood groups to
Yeah.
determine.
All right. So, all right, interesting points. But before you go, I must give you my own view. Based on my analysis of the data, and again, this is my view supported by some scholars, the genetic differences are explainable by long-term evolutionary trends. You can disagree. And according to the Rinderman survey of expert opinion, a sizable percentage of experts and their peers agree that intelligence is partially genetic and environmental. And as for admixture, some writers are doing interesting studies on admixture data. Some of the studies are inconclusive, but there are pieces pointing to a link between European heritage and intelligence. But we're not going to discuss this now because we're going to wrap up.
Okay, send me those
Yeah,
references
I
if
will.
you
I
would.
will. And I must also tell you, Richard, that I interviewed Charles Murray.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I interviewed Charles Murray, and I've been interviewing a lot of what I call dissident researchers in intelligence, like Gerard Meisenberg of Mankind Quarterly. I've interviewed Edward Dutton. I want to hear their opinions, so I can send you those videos.
You want my opinion on,
No, 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 no. Sir. I said I'm going to send you those videos
right?
to get your opinion. All right.
Oh, I don't think I can bear watching Charles Murray. I mean,
Oh God, no. But Charles is very moderate. He's a moderate guy. Like I
he's not
met.
a moderate guy. He's not a
Uh,
moderate guy.
okay.
He's a liar. I
Okay, you
mean,
really don't like Charles Murray. All right, then I don't want to get bye. Okay, then bye, sir. Thanks. We'll talk via email. All right, bye.
bye bye.
Yeah.